Hi, good afternoon. I think we're going to start. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Robert Gonzalez, the Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning. I'm not going to do the formal introduction. Cesar Lopez and on our lecture committee, professor in architecture is going to do that. I just wanted to welcome you. I'm very excited about tonight's lecture though, because this is the kind of thinking that I love. The reliance on drawings as a way for us to remain provocateurs and not just people who are drawing to make something practical, which is fine too. That's why we're here, but excited about this. And this is right up Cesar's alley because he's also a representation guru. I'm going to start us off with the land acknowledgement. Founded in 1889, UNM sits on the traditional homelands of the Tiwa people, whose descendants today include the pueblos of Sandia and Isleta. The indigenous people of New Mexico, Pueblo, Dene, Navajo, Apache, Comanche, Ute, Genízaro, and others have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the region's vitality and economy. We honor that legacy and the peoples who continue to remain its protectors and stewards. Thank you. Cesar, turn it off. It sounds really cool if you do it.
Gotcha. All right, cool. Well, thank you all for joining today. As Robert mentioned, my name is Cesar Lopez. I'm an assistant professor here, although he just said professor, so I think anyone can argue that's a promotion. Tonight I have the honor of introducing Design Earth, which I believe to be one of the most prolific practices today. Most of us have experienced their work in one way or the other, whether it's through their precise and sort of fantastical illustrations or their sobering writings, but each one of them sort of engages the medium of using speculative design work as a way to sort of frame a climate crisis that's presented to all of us today. Design Earth is a research practice founded by Rania, Ghosn, and Hadi Jazairy in 2010. They are recipients of the United States Artist Fellowship, the Architectural League for Prize for Young Architects and Designers, the Ghosn Foundation Prize, and the ACSA Faculty Design Awards. Design Earth's work has also been extremely well published and exhibited in a lot of very prestigious platforms, such as the Bauhaus Museum, the Venice Architecture Biennale, the Seoul Biennale, and the Design Biennale in Boston, and the Oslo Architecture Triennale. I will literally be all day if I'm listening to everything. So their work has been circulated so much that actually the Museum of Modern Art in New York has actually recently purchased their project After Oil. So their publications, it has the same kind of breadth and thread of success. Geographies of Trash, published in 2015, Geo Stories, which we were seeing the cut, there he is. And also which is actually currently in its third edition at Actar Publishers. So you always have to sort of add some sort of plug for someone to buy something. And The Planet After Geoengineering, published in 2021. These have become some incredibly critical, these are incredibly critical in publishing because they really sort of begin to challenge the disciplinary boundaries that we face today and explore new territories where architectural imagination can frame planetary and environmental issues. I guess what I find the most interesting about their work is essentially it's sharp and it's critical, but not only in what they're saying or what they're looking at, but also in every single medium that they choose to say that story is also critical in sort of challenging conventions. Sorry, I'm actually just geeking out right now. So I'll get to it. Rania is an associate professor of architecture and urbanism at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Hadi is an associate professor of architecture at the University of Michigan and the director of the Masters of Urban Design degree program. So please join me in welcoming our guests.
All right, thank you very much, Robert, for the introduction, Cesar for for the invitation, sorry, and Sarah for the introduction. We're delighted to be here in the room with you. Thank you all for making the time to be here in person after a long weekend and a long day in work or school. So, and for those who are joining us online as well, thank you for joining in. We will share work from, let me get to our, let's see if I can do that. Sure. Yeah, all right. Can you hear me all well in the room? Okay, so maybe I don't need the mic. Okay, so we will share work from the Geo Stories series, which we've come to think of almost as the same running title for most of our future talks as well. It's probably for the time being kind of it frames our approach to some of the recurrent concerns and not least those of the environmental risks and the climate crisis that we're living in. We're living in a protracted history of environmental crises. Earlier episodes from the Dust Bowl begin to resonate with more contemporary accelerations, sharp peaks that we're witnessing on heats, on species extinction, and many other of the familiar representations in graphs and metrics and kind of warnings of environmental scientists' reports. So I think at this point, there is a scientific consensus and a concern for public policy on how do we begin to address the question of climate change. And so our approach to that comes particularly from the cultural angle of the climate change communication question, and in particular, the role of architectural representation, and as was noted, the role of the speculative projects as a series of drawings and narratives that begin to mediate environmental concerns on how to make visible and also public the climate crisis, both from within the discipline, but also as a broader cultural project. So why are representations important for us on these critical issues of climate change? I think we begin from an acknowledgement that stories and images matter for the Earth. We are already recipients of many messages in text and in drawings that are sent our way on an everyday basis. John Berger's kind of iconic work reminds us that the word, that its cultural messages are always there for us. And more recently, in the last few days here, we were reminded that some of these practices of storytelling that kind of work their way between telling the stories of facts through maybe another side of the brain that might be more susceptible to messages late night evenings or more kind of circulated within kin, have a longer histories within storytellings. So from within that, we're reminded that stories are like people. They have a heartbeat. And every time you tell a story, you make the story stronger. But when you stop telling it, it slowly makes the story die away. And we do not want the Earth stories not to be around anymore. And in that sense, it matters what stories we tell, as Donna Haraway kind of reminds us in her own quote of a famous anthropologist that she thinks with. And you will notice that this talk is in large part also an acknowledgement of the many voices and practices that we think with, that these descriptions matters because these words make words and these words make stories. So there's a politics in the way that the world is built through storytelling, and this is the kind of politics that we want to work around as we think of the distribution of this attention, of the words we use, of the stories we tell, and those we listen to. So the cover image from the book, as well as from the talk today, is from our project, the Blue Marble Circus. And that's the one you see to the upper, the top right image there. And what you see in that image is kind of a representation of the Pantheon, here kind of cut to reveal a spherical architecture that is always there inscribed within it, but not always visible. And here it becomes, architecture becomes the house of the Earth. It becomes the lens through which you begin to filter images and tell stories. And what we'll do in the kind of opening notes is share with you the kind of intellectual diagram of why this architecture comes to matter, kind of making a transition from the earlier drawings of that same temple, the iconic imagery of the blue marble, maybe another less circulated image of the trash bag that was left behind, to kind of come back to the blue marble circus here. So architecture has historically inflected how humans understand, see, and build the world, such as the Pantheon here that incorporates the moon and many celestial gods in the way it's organized and in the way the oculus traverses to the interior. So gods are then identified by a series of environmental phenomena, rain, drought, seasons, meteorite showers, and a blazing fury sky when it's angered. So, and what we're looking at is a Piranesi etching of the Pantheon. So we come to experience it through the author of some of the most kind of fictitious and atmospheric architectures there is, as we know him through a paper architecture, but a legacy that remains quite active in the way that architecture tells its own disciplinary lineage. And that lineage and representation is not much different from that lineage in the way one understands architecture not only as the space that we inhabit, but also the sum of representations that we make out of space, what we call models, media, representations. And here we're looking at the globe of Gotor, for example, which is a 10 feet in diameter globe that shows a detailed map of the Earth's surface on the outside and a map of star constellations with astrological and mythological symbols on the inside. So architecture both as the space, the drawing, and the models of that space. One of the most reproduced images in history is the blue marble. It's an image of the Earth taken in 1972 by the crew of the Apollo 17 spacecraft on its way to the moon. It was released during a surge in the environmental movement during the 1970s and became kind of an icon image of that same movement. 5 decades after its release, we kind of live in a world that is shaped by environmental risk and consequences at a planetary scale. In 2005, in an article entitled, "Imagine that what the warming world needs now is art," Bill McKibben, the writer, climate activist, and founder of the platform 350.org, noted that this famous picture of the Earth from outer space is no longer the world we inhabit. Its poles are melting, its oceans are rising, and that we can register what is happening with satellites and scientific instruments, but can we register it in our imagination, the most sensitive of all devices? Technical indices, as important as they are not sufficiently on their own adequate for McKibben, for they fail to generate what he calls a cultural meaning or a dramatic plot that would be actively compelling for the larger public. So in that sense, the environmental crisis is not only a crisis of the physical environment, but it's also a crisis of the cultural environment, of the stories and images that we circulate and the way that allows us to relate to changes in the Earth. And if that's the case, and if we understand that some of that is predicated on the way we imagine the world, maybe what economists refer to as externalities, as things that are important to an increase in economic activities, but that remain unaccounted for in entrepreneurial outlays. Usually they're shifted to begin to be accounted for in, say, 30 or 50 years, and by generations into the future, or by other kind of circuits of value, such as public health. So we can think of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, for example, as a thing that had been for long lumped and as an economic externality in the age of fossil fuels, except that we're now beginning to inhabit the world in which we're confronted with that externality. It's no longer kind of Frankenstein's monster sitting nicely in the lab, but that monster has kind of awakened and requires that we pay attention. So what other images could we begin to think of? What other frameworks could we begin to imagine that allows us to pay attention to these externalities? Well, maybe one image that we propose to think with, and maybe it could also act as a retroactive manifesto for the environmental movement, is this image from a 1966 Life magazine's photo essay called Planet Earth by Dawn's Early Light. It's a final photograph from a series of images from the Gemini 10 shuttle, and it represents a single trash bag that mission intended to leave behind before its return mission into Earth. So this is not the flagship photograph of the project, but it's one of the many images that are taken and that kind of allow us to pay attention that that technological achievement, as sublime as it is, has required that single trash bag to be possible. And that the story of the single trash bag might need to be as important in the way that we approach technological externalities. So to stay with Donna Haraway, she says, rather than abandonment, rather than forgetting about Frankenstein's monster, maybe what we need to do is to stay with the trouble, this might be the only ethical option as we think of both technological and environmental matters. So that's the kind of framework that Design Earth operates within. So if the present predicament springs from the externalities as one set of economic mythologies, we like to think with another philosopher called Bruno Latour, as he invites us to think that the Earth, and I'm quoting, has become once again an agent of our common geostories. And that the problem for all of us now is to, whether we're in philosophy, science, or literature, and we add through the arts and design, is how do we tell such a story? So in this talk, we present a series of architectural experiments, geostories in that sense, that draw the Earth with its environmental externalities, be they landfills, mine pits, oil rigs, and the hope is that we begin to open up our environmental imagination to such stories of urgent trouble. Why is that relevant? Well, one can say that climate is always mediated. Climate, differently than weather, is a statistical abstraction, which we can only encounter through mediation, through kind of graphs over a long time, through satellite imagery. So that, and also through various forms of narratives, not very similar from the mythologies that I started with. And that architecture is also media. It has a series of representational tools, be they drawings, models, miniatures, and practices that can begin to be part of that broader project of representing the climate. Kind of to keep maybe in the back of our mind, as was noted, that these are kind of speculative stories about that future. So they all depart from a real and now and here, but then they allow themselves to imagine a future which might be slightly different and open up that imaginary to begin to plot or to give that figurative shape to these threads, as the McKibben invitation has invited us. So this work is built on that importance of the environmental imagination and on the role of the architectural project as expounded through drawings, narratives, and artifacts to become that device to incorporate externalities as part of this public communication project that explicates climate change as it begins to anticipate other words. So the talk today is centered on one of the three publications, Geostories. But it's important to just take a moment to situate it in relationship to these two other projects. So Geographies of Trash is kind of the design research publication that begins to outline the method, and I'll refer to it very briefly later on. Geostories is kind of a run of 14 projects, which we've run kind of on an accelerated pace. So if Geographies of Trash took 3 years to complete, in Geostories, each of the project was between 6 months and 2 years. So you can see more of the experimentation of the method that was developed. And in that end, Geostories became a relationship between almost a text on one side and an image on one side. And what the later book, The Planet After Geoengineering, did in a kind of series of 2 experiments, one is the graphic novel, which is the book, is to begin to imagine how can you weave in graphic formats, be it the digital animation or the graphic novel, ways of telling the story in which the images that you see, which are often very large in scale, can begin to be delaminated, framed, and in which the text can be simplified and juxtaposed so that the book can really reach to a broader audience, or at least that's the hope is. And the animation also begins to think of working with storytellers, with musicians, to begin to weave the other arts of storytelling as part of this practice. So for Geostories, as I said, it's the series of 14 projects on various matters, be they oil extraction, deep sea mining, ocean acidification, space debris, etc. The book is organized into 3 sections: terrarium, aquarium, and planetarium. So you can see kind of a legacy of a late 19th century or a 19th century fascination with the cultural project of enlightenment, on possibly the role of the arts and culture more expansively as part of the building of a public sphere. And we're happy to think of both a critique of that 19th century enlightenment, but also where we might be heading now in an age where the kind of conversations in public spheres are heavily curated or might become. So what we will do today is share with you a story from each of these sections, kind of both to outline the scale of the project, but what we'll also do, hopefully in kind of a pedagogic approach, is to try to foreground one architectural medium throughout. So we will say more on the drawing in relationship to terrarium and the After Oil project, more on the agency of the model and the aquarium, and more on the role of the material archive of the Earth and kind of the practices of curation as we think of the planetarium and the archive. So maybe just a small footnote and an apology for kind of the resolution of some of these images that you're about to see, kind of the large scale drawings. For those of you following on the screen, it might not be an issue, but we're happy to kind of share more individually at the end, more details or close-ups on some of the images if you'd like us to stay there. So we'll start with the terrarium. Frustrated by the death of his plants in polluted East London, Nathaniel Ward, who was a surgeon and amateur botanist, devised a case of glass and metal that was shown in the Great Exhibition of 1851. His display at the Crystal Palace set the craze for the small glass structure, which was later termed the terrarium, and it was part of a broader popularization of the sciences of the earth. The model miniature had then the propensity to make what was in expanding scales of the earth kind of a more intimate knowledge and experience. And in that came the question of what are the kind of modes and modalities of forms of evidence? How can aesthetics be part of a broader making things evident to an audience which is far removed away, maybe from the section of the earth or from the depth of the ocean, as we will see with the aquarium? So the kind of marriage between maybe more broadly arts and sciences, as far as the kind of the earth questions become obvious in some of these examples. So maybe if we're thinking of the contemporary terrarium, we're beginning to think of how we can learn on representing the earth in a section cut. And maybe differently from what we can learn from that terrarium is then there was a desire to kind of contain a small portion of air that was to remain pure for the plants. Here, we're really asking that the scale becomes much larger. So how do we begin maybe to confront more explicitly the many externalities here, either the depletion of the oil reservoirs in the earth or the landfills that are often covered with a kind of a layer of soil. So we're really looking at what happens in the earth's crust. So the first, in the terrarium section, After Oil proposes 3 speculative tales that explore the geography of a major oil producing region, the Arabian Gulf, in the decades after oil.
The projects After Oil make visible the main issues of the Gulf regions. And Das Island is the particular node that is the extraction node.
I maybe move too fast. If you want to say on the screen.
We have 3 nodes. Das Island is the extraction node that you can see here. Strait of Hormuz is this spot, this geography. This is the transit logistic node. And this is the 3rd node, which is the node of contamination. This is the case of Bubian. So what is the agency of images? So these images tell the story of this region through 3 speculative projects, and that are here presented in and materialized in 9 70 by 70 centimeter canvases. Das Island lies 150 kilometers off the coast of Abu Dhabi. Since the first prospection expedition in the 50s, the island developed into a major industrial facility where Abu Dhabi processes, stores, and exports oil pumped at offshore sites. Such exports are a mainstay to the economy and the main driver of urbanization, with many of the Emirates' iconic buildings built from oil wealth. Yet, the wealth of the surface and the impoverishment of the ground are rarely presented in the same frame. Thus, crude make visible such displacement of value. By collapsing the 2 sites, the above and the below. The drawing is both a timeline and a section, indexing architectural landmarks to the geological depth and times of extraction of oil across 3 depleted reservoirs. The after oil is not only a reference to the period following the depletion of oil, thus is also an exhausted site, as carbon societies race to the last drop of oil in the ground to dig deeper and build higher. The project exposes the excavated volumes of soil and stone, the inside of the earth spilled out. It is a built landform monument to the age of oil. The after oil, Das Island, is not only a reference to the period following the depletion of non-renewable resources, but also a reference to the volumes that are displaced in the race to extract the last drop of oil. In the project, the excavated volumes of soil and stone are accumulated to build the landform monument. The Strait of Hormuz, here shown from the bottom of the ocean, is the second of those sites. It is a critical choke point with 20% of oil traded worldwide moving across a 30-mile corridor. The strait was never actually shut down in spite of persistent anxieties of possible obstructions by regional actors. The revenues of oil futures perpetuate the geopolitical rivalry between countries on both shores of the Gulf. The project here and the tale we're telling in After Oil is a territorial board game, a hybrid of risk, the game of diplomacy, and monopoly, the game of real estate trading. The grand chessboard repurposes the strait into a real estate geopolitical game of speculative urbanism between the traditional adversaries across the Gulf. Those who call it Persian Gulf in black, those who call it Arabian Gulf in white. In the process, 3 contested islands get absorbed among the pieces of speculative urbanism. Each piece is an iconic project from the history of speculative urbanism, Plan Voisin, Delirious New York, the Metabolists. In the process, the territory is reformatted in relation to power structures. This is the third site, Bubian. The end of the Persian Gulf War in 1991 was accompanied by what is considered as the world's largest oil spill, which drastically affected Kuwait's coastal environment, or the geotrauma of Kuwait. The oil industry, business as usual, puts the world through another form of violence, more diffused, slower in its effect. That is the anthropogenic climate change, tied to increase in carbon dioxide emissions. The flat and lowlands of the island become more and more vulnerable to sea level rise. But there once was an island gives form to the invisible threats of climate change. A series of vertical nabkhas elements are inserted into the highest 16 elevation mounts of the island to stabilize its shrinking shorelines. The project halts all major development works currently in plan to transform the area into a megaport and tourist resort. The island continues to be, in our project, uninhabited by humans. It hosts sea turtles, antelopes, and other life forms that withstand the temperature and acidity associated with anthropogenic climate change. After Oil is not a mere switch in energy producers towards green technologies. The project calls a reform of the geographic imagination by giving spatial form the nodes and externalities of the energy systems.
So we will briefly begin to think, once we've exploded that black box of technology, and the energy system is, say, one of these technological systems, that you can never capture it entirely in one site or one node, but you need to follow it. You need to trace its development from extraction along transportation route, where it's accumulated in cities, where it evaporates in the atmosphere. So you inevitably end up with many sites and many drawings. And part of the question for us is, how do we begin to assemble? How do we begin to put together one image or one representation that can leave the viewer with one impression from these sites? So this project, Trash Peaks, is kind of, we're introducing it, sharing it with you on as one experiment in assembling these various individual drawings into one totality. And at the same time, to begin to think of how do we shift from two-dimensional to three-dimensional forms of representation and explore forms of maybe popular media and representation. So Trash Peaks is a diorama set up here on waste management system in Seoul. It consists of 3 artifacts: a printed carpet that hosts the kind of diagrammatic infographic sets of information on the project, a folding screen in 6 silk panels in the back, and you'll see how these panels came about, and the 3D printed ceramic tableware here, which are the kind of miniatures from the projects that you see in the back, and begin to establish a dioramic relationship with the drawings. So this project comes at the heels or after we had completed a kind of a more extensive research on geographies of trash, which had looked at the geographies of waste management system in the broader Great Lakes region, kind of particularly looking at the greater kind of Michigan region as a way to begin to think of a design research method to articulate through it an approach to design research on questions of the environment. So that research was kind of in 4 steps: to construct a theoretical framework that builds on adjacent knowledge from spatial fields, be it planning, landscape, environmental ecologies, territorial planning, etc. To represent, which is to begin to map that system in various diagrams and maps. To project, and you've seen one instance through the After Oil project, to begin to insert speculative imaginations on some of the nodes of these sites. So some of the questions that the representation brings about becomes the bread and butter for the project. And then, having had a series of these projects, the question is, how do we begin to bring them together into maybe one assembly, which is at the same time putting projects together, but also building maybe an audience of people around it. So the Trash Peak drawings were at a stage quite similar to the After Oil project at some point. There were 6 individual project that looked at various technologies of recycling, incineration, recycling of electronic waste, etc., and each in a speculative project. And then the task was, how do we begin to move from the individual canvas to the panorama? And in that, the search is often to look for cultural forms that resonates with the site and the city in which the event is happening. So somehow you can build a conversation up to the point where your project exists, and you intervene within a broader set of imagination. It's almost like a ping pong. Someone has already thrown you the ball and you're kind of throwing it back. So in this case, and in that act, is not just a playing, but there's often a moving beyond, the critique that is incorporated. So maybe more of a spiral than a ping pong in that respect. So here, the painting that you see, the Irworobogondo, is literally a painting of the sun and the moon, as you see them, with 5 peaks. And it was traditionally a very important place behind the king's throne, and a very idyllic image of a nature that remains untouched and not transformed by human action. So for us, that presented almost a motif that we began to work with and reassemble these 5 distinct canvases into this continuous landform here of solid waste management practices in a highly stylized landform, which presents these speculative forms, maybe recover some of their symbolic values. So to say trash is a worthwhile subject, but that nature that we're thinking of is already transformed, always transformed. It's kind of a combination of technology and nature rather than something that remains outside of us, not touched. So the infographic carpet begins here to visualize the sites, actors, and processes of waste management, which include regulation changes, processing facilities, sanitary landfill size, regulation, recycling systems, amongst many other issues. And, you know, they correspond on the floor in relationship to kind of the panel that hosts the speculative project. And the idea is you can have different modalities and speeds of experiencing and levels of engagement. You might just pass by, sit, or kind of decide to engage more thoroughly and begin to walk through the specificities of the project. And then the three-dimensional miniatures here in ceramics begin to be the chopsticks, the serving bowl, the stacked plate, the flask salt and the pepper shakers, and they're used as a ceremony to kind of recover some of the rituals as ways of discussing the arts of the urban more broadly conceived. So not only kind of a technocracy around questions of urban management, but also a broader aesthetic, ritualistic relationship to the way that cities operate. So the aquarium. The aquarium is a model of the world. In natural history, the aquarium view is a split view that shows domains both above and below the surface of the water, such as this scene of a prehistoric life that is based on evidence from fossil reconstruction. The aquarium is also a kind of a popular craze, which was launched in early Victorian England, that hosted the first public aquarium in the London Zoo in 1853. It's also the time that the first manual, the first publication around the aquarium was launched. It's called Ocean Gardens, an unveiling of the wonders of the deep sea. And their handbook aquarium care, because people didn't necessarily know how to clean up their small miniatures that can be, you know, they can be major public buildings in a city, but they can also be smaller objects that can be on everyone's table. And it's that scalar ambiguity or work across scale that is exciting to those. And the handbooks actually make a point of emphasizing that the aquarium has a pedagogic role. They say that the mind requires a special education without which the eye and the ear perceive but little of the miracles passing before that. And then this is part of the birth of the idea that the aesthetic evidence, which was partially there in the terrarium, here began to have an expanded notion of what that can be, because you began to have both a documentation of the life of the ocean, but also much speculation and fantasy about what could be there. So, and you can tell that from the various display that begins to almost put a Leviathan in the aquarium. You work across that limit between stories that are repeated over time and then discoveries that happen as this 70% of the Earth's surface was becoming progressively coming under kind of scientific scrutiny and documentation. So this call to educate the eye is timely to remember at the moment where industrial civilization is altering the ocean at a very large scale. So they're both the oceans, some of the Earth's largest resource for life, and some of its biggest dumping ground. Mostly not only because of the plastic trash that it takes, but because it has so far absorbed much of the excess in CO2 emissions. So the levels of increase in temperature that we see are only a fraction of what would have been if the oceans has not absorb that excess, which means that it has significantly transformed the acidity and the life from within, but that the tipping point of these oceans, once it reaches saturity, will mean that the impact it has on temperatures on land will be drastically faster. The story gets nastier from there. But for the sake of now, let's say it's acted as a significant buffer zone to the increase in temperature. So I think I saw Ala walk in. So this will sound familiar, as one of your colleagues from a few years ago was part of this project. So this call to educate the eye, we say, is timely, not least because the ocean, which was until then a classic example of what we call the planetary commons or the global commons, their domains like Antarctica or the geostationary orbit or the deep sea or the high seas that humanity has agreed to protect from all industrial intervention. And yet, even these strictest of agreement have not managed to protect the oceans, and in particularly the deep seabed, very deep parts of the ocean, such as the one you see here, which is roughly an area the size of Europe, where there's an expansion of deep sea mining in search of minerals that operates for allies for many digital technologies. So this is called, the site is the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and it has a very large deposit and an exploration that has started in 2001 with licenses and are unfolding into actual expeditions now. So what you see in the rigid kind of lines are the many concessions, both for private companies and for states. They're nicely in the kind of valley of where things happen in a flatter area. And on the edges, the dotted squares are areas that were deemed areas of particular environmental concerns to be protected, kind of these large volumes of roughly 100 by 100 kilometers in the middle of the ocean that were deemed to kind of salvage the environmental consciousness of what would otherwise be a significant transformation event. So part of what the installation does is to say, well, these areas of environmental concerns cannot be that dispersed, and they cannot sit so kindly and politely to the edges of where extraction is happening. So if we care about ecology and if we care about extraction, let's see how these can provisionally cohabit in one space, not as one then the other or one next to the other. But can we think what happens if we're thinking of them together? So what you see, the 9 consolidated squares here is the diagram of this project. It's an attempt to overlay these scenarios to allow us to think again speculatively of what happens if these kind of cores of the ocean begin to give us a more concrete sense of these dimensions, scales, sites, as such environmental transformations happen.
The installation is a grid of 9 modules, each of which embodies a contradictory concern of ecology and economy within the same territory. So the 9 aquariums are various sites that try to demonstrate a number of issues that we're trying to unfold in the proposals. I'm going to show a few of them. Hanging gardens. The mineral rush on the ocean floor has significant consequences on the seabed. To conserve the flora and fauna of the mining area, linear transects of the seabed are relocated, incubated into a benthic ecosystem, and later grafted again onto the seabed once mining is completed. The transects are suspended by cables from a grid of superficial floats. Below the water towers, the sharply toothed suction machines churn and rip the ocean surface. A catchment dome caps mining activities on the ocean floor to contain a localized sediment plume. Polluted water is transported into a series of inverted water towers for treatment and gradually released back into the ocean after processing. Iron towers. The uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere decreases the pH of the Earth's oceans. Vertical tensile structures with high iron concentration of water in their tubes stimulate photosynthesis in plankton, converting dissolved carbon dioxide into carbohydrates and oxygen. The Parliament of Refugees contains within its envelope sea turtles, scallops, bleached corals, drowning wetlands, hammerhead sharks, algae, and Homo sapiens. The Parliament is connected to the center of the Earth through a submerged volcano. Bruno Latour tells us the challenge of governing the ocean is that it lacks formal representation, both political and aesthetic, through which to think this immense greenhouse with species that have very different demands for their survival.
So it's that double meaning of the term representation, which continues to be very significant in the work. It's a representation as we understand it as the parliament, a political space of assembly, but it's representation in the act of redrawing, drawing as the practice that we deploy in that quest of assembling the political space. The aquarium as such is a tool for us, is a model on how do we begin to reckon that scale between an individual encounter and scales that might be quite collective and enormous in their impact. It also has a few significant attributes. Remember, this section is also about the model. So not only the drawing, but what does the model achieve in that respect? One is the aquarium is a three-dimensional territory. So if we're often used to think of the threats of the ocean as in the way they impact sea level rise on coastal cities, here we're saying the human is not the center of the impacts in the story, at least not immediately. They're of course part of why we humans care. But the ocean is also a volume. It's a three-dimensional space, and some of these transformations happen from within and not only at the edges. So it's first of all that importance of the three-dimensional space. Second of all, as these little kind of redfish point to, the aquarium is always populated. We rarely go to an aquarium to see it kind of just filled with water. We go to an aquarium because we understand that differently from kind of the Lewis Carroll's kind of chart of the ocean, which just has coordinates on an empty map, the aquarium has always species that live in it. The appeal of the aquarium also is that it's in the now. It's something that is present in the same space with you. So it doesn't rely on kind of the anxiety of exponential curves and mediations of information, but it can be something that is experienced as kind of what scholars have discussed as a form of slow media. So if we're thinking of how do you mediate the slow violence of climate change, maybe what we need to think of is not more accelerated representation, but things that allow the viewer to slow down thought, maybe not very dissimilar from the tea ceremony, and stay in that moment and begin to engage, ask themselves questions on the implications of this process. And of course, the aquarium is this here because it's the physical artifact, but because it's a model, it's also there. It represents a world that is way beyond it, a world that is at the same time a set of scientific information, but of storms, jellyfish, but also of many monsters that have historically inhabited that imagination. And it's that uncanny ability to bridge between various modes of evidence that allow the aquarium to continue to enchant us maybe and delight us in various ways. The appeal also is that the aquarium, because of its scalar kind of representation, is always a relationship between a section, a sample, as well as a vision of the totality, the panorama. So you're always working between the detail and the big picture, between really a sample of that space and an image of what that totality of the space is. And it's in these various kind of scales that fit neatly or not that we begin to fathom with that totality, which we call the ocean space. So on the planetarium, and how do we begin to think of it as this vast geoinformatic archive of the Earth that is resolutely material, as the various kind of collections that reside in Natural History Museum begin to tell us, the collections are very much rocks and samples of libraries, modes of evidence that actually rests in these cultural institutions, in these museums. One can say that the arrival of what has been called the Anthropocene has been a way to invite us to think of history with a big H in the way that it intersects many smaller histories, in the way that it intersects human history or the history of people, in the way that it intersects natural history or the history of the Earth with its many evidences, and that geological kind of bigger span of things that are beyond one's own, but beyond the human's lifespan. And in that, the archive, this material archives, becomes something that holds a particular relevance if we are beginning to think of how do we begin from within this institution to mediate this question of climate change, to try and build a common sense of how do these museums begin to curate for a chamber for the Anthropocene, a climate change exhibit, which doesn't resort exclusively to the various screens. If your experience has been any similar to ours in such museums, you often are transported to many colors, textures of the Earth in many of the galleries, the ways glass has been used to model. And then, after a couple of hours on a Sunday, just as you're starting to be hungry, you kind of walk into this last gallery, often kind of darkly lit with the various digital screens on the wall and expert testimonies that are recorded and telling you the story of climate change in a language that is very different from what you had encountered already. So if you're really already a Greenpeace activist, you've signed on, you might take the brochure or you might just walk through it and just stream out. And we've done a few experiments on how, that could be thought of differently. It's not the subject of this talk, but it's what animates that desire to continue to think through this material archive, which is the Earth. Not least, as now we're beginning to be introduced to this idea of extraplanetary geographies as having a very material legal significance, with many private initiatives that are speculating in off-source extractive industries, be it for water, platinum, many mineral groups, and other resource niches. So here you're looking at one rendering from planetary resources as an example of sending swarms of low-cost robotic spacecraft to extract resources from near-Earth asteroids, not for their return to Earth, but as ways of fueling the trips as humans aspire, or some aspires to leave the Earth and kind of move further away. So you kind of fuel up on your way to other planetary bodies. So Cosmorama charts the territories of outer space in 3 geostories that begin to speculate on the expansion of private extractive industry interests into what was called the province of all mankind. And these speculative stories are here organized vertically into 3 vignettes. The first one, from your left to the right, is mining the sky, which kind of builds on this short episode that I started with. The second one is on the planetary arc, the one in the middle, and the kind of the condition of the 6th extinction on Earth. And the third is Pacific symmetry, and it ends not far from where that single trashback has started, by asking us to think of space debris here on Earth.
Mining the Sky speculates on the 2015 US Space Act. The act allows US citizens to engage into the commercial exploration and exploitation of space resources in violation of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, that decrees that no celestial body is subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by mean of use or occupation, or by any other means. The architecture of the new space age makes visible the intertwined and conflicting interests of the United States, the United Nations, private investors, and scientific research. The captured asteroids are despun and towed to a mining depot at Earth-Moon Lagrange point, a position where the combined gravitational pulls from the 2 celestial objects constitute a stable equilibrium point. Robotic arms process the asteroids. They either hollow out the space resource, collecting the trail of debris in the fabricated cave, or mine the surface to carve out the face of the gods of the new space age, a cosmic Rushmore. The mission partnership between NASA and the US Air Force maintains security of rare earth storage at Lagrange points. The fortification of asteroid extraction stations constitute the first artificial constellation made visible to human eye from Earth. Animals march into the Empire State Arc. The planetary arc is a collection of living animals, both those that were launched into space on scientific missions, as well as for a wide variety of other species currently threatened by the 6th mass extinction. All aboard the cosmic architecton, animals are sent out, each in its cubicle, on an arc to the International Space Station. The International Space Station is repurposed into a microcosm for various life forms. Some 10,000 years later, somewhere between Venus and the Earth, the offspring of these fellow travelers embark on an earthbound journey. They land at Point Nemo in the Ocean Point, in the Pacific Ocean, at a vortex spiral island where decommissioned satellites and other space debris are brought back from orbit and recycled. Point Nemo is already the cemetery of deorbited spacecrafts, where space debris and satellites decommissioned after 15 years of operation are brought back from orbit. The Pacific holds the legacy of earlier technological debris. In 1947, the US designated the island of Micronesia as the strategic trust of territory to conducted nuclear testing with the directive that the US should promote the economic advancement and self-sufficiency of the inhabitants and protect the inhabitants again from loss of their lands and resources. In the 21st century, US strategic territory, the US buries its space trash in the Pacific Islands and in turn promises to grant the low-lying islands, particularly vulnerable to sea level rise, a physical territory following the loss of their land. Point Nemo becomes the landfill of the space age, in which the vestiges of space objects are recycled into bits of sovereignty to house all climate refugees of the Pacific of the planet.
So Cosmorama is the spectacle machine that narrates the uncanny of the new space age. It's similar to earlier image machines, the panorama and the diorama, in that it's a form of popular entertainment through which the spectator views a set of scenes that put the cosmos on stage. It materializes gods or creatures of immense power. It magnifies minuscule creatures. It pulls away far away things and puts them all in relations. In the installation, each suspended head is a Janus face of a 3D model of an asteroid that is pulled from the NASA open source website and the related Greek god whose names it carries. So each model is both a landscape and a portrait in the best of the tradition. And it takes a thing or two from science and mythology, not unlike Gaia, which has become a main figure in the way that the Anthropocene has been anthropomorphized. The miniature is also the material specimen from these larger collection. The centerpiece here is a meteorite on loan from the Harvard Museum of Natural History, which ironically enough is also significantly cut between a rugged kind of side and a more sectional cut where you can see the various mineral concentrations of that material. It was also probably the largest and kind of the most expensive insurance item in many of the galleries. So kind of just the logistics of getting such a thing set up is not to be belittled. But I would say, you know, seeing it there suspended between the various artifacts just helps ground what is otherwise maybe a 3D print and begin to imagine what these cosmic Rushmores might begin to look like if we begin to speculate using that material specimen at hand. And maybe also the importance of such wonder-charged narratives should not be overlooked when we're conceiving of planetary relationships at the moment of crisis. After all, environmentalism is first and foremost a protest on behalf of values. It's an engagement with the world beyond the tunnel values and visions of resource extraction. And it's tempting to think that such attention to wonder and stories can make us care. Thank you. How are we doing on time? Good. Okay.
Hi, my name is Trevor. Thank you for coming. I've always been very familiar with your work because of the law, showing us your drawings and how you represent information. And it's always been really inspiring. I was hoping you could tell me a little bit about your practice of using different hybrid drawing techniques as well as overlapping different graphic styles to express different information.
It's thank you for coming, Trevor, and thank you for the question and the interest. So for us, the drawing is a method. So it's a method in the sense that as you mentioned, it's both a documentation of the word. So we use the drawing as a way to condense, bring together an information from various fields, almost like one clipboard where you can begin to put together information, but where you can also begin to relate them spatially. The drawing is also the space where you can begin to imagine how these could be differently. So it's at the same time a space of what is there, but also a space of what could be different. And I think we're working with various, giants on whose shoulders this work begins to kind of build, both within the discipline, but also in adjacent fields. So one figure that often comes up in the conversation, maybe because of the 19th century legacy of some of this work, is the geographer, Alexander von Humboldt. And we like to think of the way he thinks of the portrait of nature. And that's the way he presents his work. And for us, the squarish format was initially a hesitation to move from landscape concerns and the landscape, and to begin to think of them more as figured moments, as nodes, as really moments of deserving singular individual attention. And I think the way he presents the portrait of nature is one way that allows us to think of various domains or sciences of the earth in relationship to each other. So we're interested in the relationship between botany and elevation. It's never a singular thing, but it's always a skewer of many things. So you can see that there's a relationship of, and you can tell from some of the research on textures that there's a desire to work with that legacy. There's also then various techniques of putting images in relationship to each other. So how does, and I think Hadi might have more maybe on that, on kind of the image as a vocabulary for the work. Some of that might start to work with images that are very familiar in the environmental history of architecture. So you might have seen, the Buckminster Fuller reference here, but rather than the dome on Manhattan, where we've assumed one set of relationship between architecture in the figure of the dome, urbanism as in the city, and then the environment, we begin to redistribute these elements in a different set of priorities and relations. So architecture is not just serving the air of the inhabitants of the city, it's actually serving to cap within the environment, within the marine environment. So you begin to rework or invert, not very dissimilar from the folding screen. You begin to work from elements that have a strong appeal and presence in the architectural imaginary, except that they're maybe almost like a hand puppet. They're telling a different story. They're there, they have their attention, but the words that they're saying are actually the words that you would like them to say. So there's that agency of the drawing also of and maybe just to say on, we've maybe briefly said why the section, but you'll see that the relationship of the section and the axon are often very present in the work. The section, because of the way we believe in geography as a framework, it's always situated. When you take a section, you always need, an XY line and then a Z depth. It's always somewhere in the world. It's not an ideology of how do you think of energy system. It's actually the actual deployment in one specific region of the world. So the section, when you take it, it then opens up another set of concerns. And because of their systemic relations, a section in relationship to the axon allows you to imagine a similar set of relationships that could happen otherwise. So it begins to work on that tension between something which is very situated and something which might be more universal or systemic.
Yes, I think it is very important for us to consider the drawing as the substance of architecture and the building as a copy of the drawing, because we think that the drawing is able to capture the essence of of the new, the essence of change, the essence of the critique of the everyday. So the drawing has this immense capacity to capture really the substance of the discipline. We were, as Rania was mentioning, we were fascinated by the work of Alexander von Humboldt, who talked about microcosm on a sheet of paper. This sentence is so strong. How can you capture, a macrocosm of a mountain, of a valley, of a river, on a sheet of paper? How can you, through a synthetic gesture, capture, whole complexity? So we were really fascinated in this ability of the visual language of the drawing, in particular, to crystallize, these elements. Then we asked ourselves, how do we move from the sort of the drawings that are representations of geography, for example, the work of Van Humboldt, to drawings that are architectural drawings, urbanism drawings. So we looked at, the world according to architects, the world according to urbanists. Rania was talking about Buckminster Fuller, but we also looked at, different other references, such as Super Studio, for sure, extremely important in the relation between the physical, the digital, the network, how we can talk about, a totality, the planetary, and so that was extremely important. We moved then from the image itself to the story. How can we then, once we understand the work of, the discipline to capture these important moments in drawings, how can we then use speculation, but as a sequence of images? Think about the cinematic. So we started with, the triptych, 3 images telling the story, basically, a sort of haiku, right? The Japanese haiku. How can you capture, 3 moments that tell something that is much, much longer than a sequence of 3 things? So the polyptychs, and then we looked at the work of Godard, Jean-Luc Godard, who really has some fundamental position on the visual and the agency of the visual. What is the specificity of the visual vis-a-vis the alphabetic? The alphabetic is, can be very precise, can isolate things in a very rational way, but the visual has this capacity to situate, to put things in a context. So it's the opposite of the alphabetical, that isolates, that defines the specificity of the thing. The visual connects what the thing is vis-a-vis a certain context.
And depending, I think you haven't seen evidence of that, but there's 2 evidences that operate in, well, in different lengths, but in different also views of the future. You have a kind of a 15-minute roughly of the planet after geoengineering animation, which begins to look at one technology here at the planetary scale, that of geoengineering and its various manifestation, and not very dissimilar from After Oil. It begins to imagine the planet as it's seeking to implement geoengineering and begins to imagine what physically that world might look like. And that's, maybe a bit dark, or so we've been told, more black and white with some splashes of color. And then you get a very different kind of aesthetic view. One might say maybe the reverse of the coin, one called Elephant in the Room, which is more of an kind of a fable that traces or resurrects an elephant that was killed and put in display in the Museum of Natural History, that here takes on the streets in New York as part of a broader call for climate action. So this is more, pink and yellow saturated in the city, and it ends with a very kind of concrete call for climate action, but again, through the modality of the fable. And one might say maybe not differently very much from kind of the work of Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, that actually starts from a chapter called A Fable for Tomorrow. So the fable is actually a language to speak of very concrete concerns and actions in the world.
And now I want to talk about the visual again, and talk about in our understanding, the visual is something that we want to use as a slow medium. So from, when we started the practice in 2010, we immediately decided to use black and white and line drawings because we wanted a slow medium. a medium that would be able to capture the things in their essence, in their substance, not more, not less. So how can you, through a line, capture a maximum amount of information? A slow medium. So this is also connected to the way we use axonometries, or the way we use section axonometries. Sections are for us extremely important, because this is, for us, this what makes the difference between the view of an architect and the view of a cinematographer, for example. The architect looks into what is invisible, what is the structure of things. So this is something that we insist on. Yes.
Yeah, within the discipline, who is your ideal audience, and maybe at the planetary scale, who's your audience?
Ooh. Well, within the discipline, we've always thought that students in an architectural studio, maybe as they near their thesis, would find in the work something that is both kind of anchored in a method. So if you follow the geographies of trash, maybe because of the way it was developed, it actually models a way of getting from a question and a site to a series of projects down into the installation. And I think part of the work has been mostly pedagogic in that sense. I think it started from our desire not to only think of our work as things that exist in specialized seminars, where only those who care about landscapes of energy or satellite images and the way they produce a totality of the earth would only go, but as a way where only through acting in the design imaginary that some of these concerns may be not very appealing at first, such as those of waste management, might begin to be a first resonance. And then hopefully that the people who begin to think of them and stay with them can begin to come up with solutions that are even more fantastic than the one we propose, build their own collaboration. But it's kind of like a seed, or maybe initially we thought of it as almost like a cough syrup, as something that is tasting fabulous for us to kind of deal with a pain maybe that is less than ideal. So at least within the discipline, you know, BARC and ARC kind of students who think from, well, at least that's the aspiration.
But I think it is also very important for us to go beyond the discipline itself and start to think about, you know, how can we, you know, as designers, you know, face global issues, right? What are the tools that are given to us in order to comprehend or even have an impact on global issues? Climate change. How can I, as an architect, as an urbanist, as a landscape architect, have an impact on some of these issues? So we thought that it is a little bit overwhelming for us with the tools we have to be able to understand what natural processes are, what, you know, geographic sections are, what trash is, what energy is. And we thought we would start to think about alliances, start to think about, you know, ways to use our drawings to, you know, bring concerns from other disciplines. Mainly, I would say mainly landscape architecture, but beyond that, geography, even, you know, geographic concerns into the discipline. How do they make sense to us? You know, I teach in the urban design department at the Tubman College, and we're very much interested in using geography as a framework, right? So how can we go beyond just the sort of metropolis? You know, start to look at the hinterlands, start to look at, you know, questions of trash, questions of energy, and start to imagine, you know, different ways of addressing these issues. And also, I think, which is very important to us, is take a position vis-a-vis what was our role in the past. You know, what was, you know, we have been part of, you know, the sort of the problem. And I think we can, by understanding the repercussions of urbanization on the planet, we can also be part of the solution if we acknowledge the capacities of the discipline to capture some of these concerns and maybe to think through them. And the drawing has this capacity to, to capture these things and to make them plausible, tangible, to capture them through sections, through annotations, through, research. So we, a lot of our students, work with cartographies, but also use research, and include in their cartographies research, and then, research information, research data, and then start to speculate based on those, on those elements. So it is very important also for us to think about our contribution as, facilitating, connections with other disciplines and creating alliances.
Maybe broadly within kind of some might say that, the current emergence of climate fiction, maybe as it has been filtered through architectural representation, is within a broader continuum of the appeal of science fiction, which is something that scientists have worked across, realized, kind of worked within that tension of situating concerns of the now in a language that might be more fabulous. And I think within that, some of the work is of appeal to people in science fiction studies because they see in it not only the capacity of the literary, but also the capacity of the representational and the drawing to be part of this language. Maybe with the elephant in the room, maybe because the narrator was Donna Haraway, there was kind of an appeal to that work, which was, anyone who cares to listen to what, Donna is engaged in was drawn to that work because she herself had written the piece on the kind of the Carl Ackley Hall where that elephant lives in the American Museum of Natural History in New York. So for us, to have her voice bringing that elephant back to life was almost that research process that comes back to bite at its tail, that it started there and she's the narrator. So it's in one way looking for the voice of the storyteller, that in her act of telling the story over and over into many audiences, there the question of the climate crisis is thought of in the various legacies of racism, the kind of what she calls the teddy bear taxidermy, which is that combination of the kind of a particular white male imaginary on the control of nature, and beginning to work on and asks cultural institutions not to host climate change exhibits that are funded by climate change deniers or by supported by the fossil fuel industry, because some level of consistency with the message would be appreciated kind of within these cultural institutions. That's a bigger concern. We can also leave you with the elephant in the room as people exit, but maybe I'm too eager to share. Yeah.
It's not much of a question, more of an observation. When you were showing the aquarium project and talking about slow
media.
Yeah, exactly. Slow medium and the representation through that in 3D. One of the images, I believe it was like a starch 3D print that you submerge in water and let that come to fall. I just think that's incredible.
Yeah, it was an intense series of experiments. Thank you for appreciating. Yeah.
Yes.
Last question. I'm kind of going off what the theme's question was about reaching out to a larger audience that are not architecture majors like myself, who have not heard of you guys. This is the first time I've seen this. How do you get such an incredibly important message that you've dedicated 10+ years into, that is a global message to the masses that would not understand this if they were not explained it? And you said that great example of walking through a museum for 2 hours, and by that time you're just like sensory overload. And then the last thing you do is you see the climate thing. They do it here at the Natural History Museum. Right at the end, it's all about like, oh, these are some different fuels that we can use, and you're like, I don't even care anymore, I'm moving on. How do you guys capture this incredibly important message to the people that would not be able to understand it in such depth and intellectual status?
Maybe, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is for us, it's a core belief. It's the agency of the visual. So I don't know if I can. Yeah. So the idea, the visual is a pre-alphabetic language. So we learn the alphabet through images. So the visual is something that connects with, not only the rational world, but connects with, a more complex and a deeper world. So for us, the agency of aesthetics, of the image itself, the capacity of the image to generate an emotional response is something that is extremely important. This is also something we work, we discuss a lot with our students. Once you have the issue, once you develop your position, once you propose a strategy, how do you communicate it in a way that it connects, that you can connect to it, that that it touches you, or it does or it does not. So we're very much interested in this last effort in order to find an audience and to make sense. So I think Rania wants to...
This is our, we started from a seminar, kind of expanded to think about an architecture studio. And then we were thinking that the currency we're trading in, the cards we're trading in might actually have an audience beyond. So this is our experiment in that respect. Let's see if this comes across. I don't know if you need, if we need to put this thing off while we play this, if we don't get the feedback, or I can try. We don't get the sound. Okay. I did share. I don't know if we can share screen. I have share sound here, but should I say share from away from desktop? Okay. Should I'll try one more time, and if it works. All right. I'm on mute. How come it's? Oh, it's maybe this thing. Is there a way we can override this for a second, please?
There is no bigger.
All right, she saved us. Let's go.
A visitor to the museum notices small things, caught up in their own interests and the bias this brings. What does this allow to go unaddressed? The elephant in the room, as you may have guessed. There is no bigger problem often ignored than the climate change we are marching toward. Familiar with the feeling of being dismissed, the elephant trumpets, a crisis does exist. She lets out an alarm call to signal the herd to stampede into the streets out from where they were stirred. She broke out of the Museum of Natural History to protest human behavior in all its misery. Thick in the air and all over the day is a butane, propane, black carbon bouquet. Climate issues have become more robust as diesel, paraffin, and petrol combust. The African elephant stomps down the street. She is not detainable and not discreet. She raises her trunk to sound a deafening drum. Enough is enough. Surely you aren't all just dumb. She occupies Wall Street and protests in Times Square, while sirens serenade and flies buzz in the air. This matriarch elephant and 7 more died, just so the museum could become more alive. The Hall of African Mammals is where they were taken, waiting over a century for a time to awaken. The alarm is the centerpiece where their bodies were staged, frozen in a nightmare as if they were caged. Around the room, other captive subjects stand by within dioramas that are stacked 2 tiers high. The rhinoceros, gorilla, ostrich, and lion silently protest in a perpetual die-in. The elephant never forgets the source of its scar. Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far. A celebrated conservationist with a liking for hunting is the American president the elephant was confronting. The big stick is the rifle President Roosevelt had in hand as he stalked the elephant's footprints across open land. His son, Kermit, joined in on the Africa expedition and shot her small calf, taking after the politician. The elephant twitches to life in the Africa Hall, as if no time has passed. She remembers it all. Her reddish-brown eyes with German glass in their place, open to look museum goers in the face. She devours a book that a companion had written on structures of power and knowledge she did not fit in. The teddy bear patriarchy is a violent tale of capitalism, supremacy, and the white human male. With eyes no longer blind, she sees what her body can make, the world on her mind that no one can take. She looks around the room and says, the one thing I know is that the teddy bear patriarchy will have to go. The creature denounces the stuffed teddy and its monsters. She has had quite enough of environmental imposters. The equestrian statue, the plaque honoring David Koch, were swallowed using her trunk shortly after she woke. The mammal's belly rumbles with resonant demands. To decolonize, divest, and dismantle, she firmly stands. Like a calving iceberg, earthquake, or volcanic eruption, her trumpeting call thunders a long-distance disruption. Her revival starts an autopsy fit for the ages, where tools are used to dissect the museum in stages. Natural history becomes an architectural taxidermy in a plan to make the most avid climate deniers squirmy. Only the museum's facade remains in place to repair the damage to the very last trace. It frames a graveyard where the elephant can finally rest with the enormous weight she has lifted right off of her chest. In the garden of a damaged planet, no collection is held, only the demand for action. That's why the elephant rebelled. A climate countdown 2 degrees clock will keep time and enforce the 12 years that remain for us all to change course. Each year, 1 bar of actions counters the change that's been caused. The clock ticks, the bars tighten, and it cannot be paused. Around the elephant's graveyard, the margins grow thin until the final alarm sounds and the endings begin. So down the street we go with the elephant inside, always mustering her grit as our climate action guide. And if somehow you happened to miss her, just take a step back and look at the big picture.
All right, thank you very much.